All right, welcome back to our second session on the subversion of the subject in the dialectic of desire. Where we left off was, I believe, on page 677. Is that correct, Matan?
Yep, right around at the top.
Yeah. So I've been rereading everything, and I imagine that many of you all have as well. So I'm excited to go through this material with you guys. Upon second read or third read, however, I don't know how many it's been. Many little things have stood out to me that I would like to raise as we progress. So I'm not going to make any comments right now, but I think as we progress, we can have some productive interventions. And I encourage everyone else to intervene as well. Um, yeah, some of these things are extremely, uh, I guess you could say they are extremely helpful about clarifying where we were in seminar 16 regarding the subject of knowledge, as well as this notion of discourse and how discourse fits into all of this. Last time we really spent, I think, a lot of time, which was helpful, on these distinctions between the subject of science and Lacan's particular version of Hegel, which is a very strange, not strange, but it's like this Hegel of the absolute, of absolute knowledge. And I think we concluded, I think correctly, that this is a Kojevian reading of Hegel. We'll see this even more in today's sort of section of the text, precisely because of how desire fits into the Hegelian structure. And if you've ever read Kojev's introductions to the phenomenology, you'll see that the core concept is desire as well. Um, which is something almost which mediates the absolute in a certain way, and which also sets up what, if you saw my interview with the Malad and Dolar, this notion of oracular truth, and the reason that uh, so you it's quite beautiful, I think, because you have like also Alain Badiou makes this claim as well of like Socrates, Descartes, Hegel, Freud, Lacan as progenitors or sort of a genealogy of figures of oracular truth. And we'll get to what this means actually in a moment. This notion that de- desire almost like pre situates knowledge in a certain way, and that the signifier has a determining factor in the dialectic of desire. Anyways, this book that Dolar wrote about in a very famous essay, which has not been translated, famous just according to the general, um well, according to the Slovene school, it's famous. It's his commentary on this book um, called The Real and Its Double by this French philosopher, which I highly recommend you read. It's a very elusive text. It's elusive in the sense that it's written super lucidly, but it contains this like extremely dense elaboration of this precise idea of truth is oracular. And, oracular, what the hell is that? It's like the Oracle of Delphi and the question of fate, right? Which is also, of course, central to the theory of Oedipus and Sophocles. So I love all of that extremely much. So you see the point, oh, is that Rosé wrote this book about fate, the real and its double, and oracular truth, but he never mentioned Lacan. And the other interesting side point, and then we can begin, Maton, is that Rosé is a Nietzschean. And so there's also this kind of Nietzschean uh, genealogy of the oracular, I guess. I wrote a review of the book as well, and I teach it in my philosophy classes, and the students absolutely adore the book because he brings all of these strange fables from like one from Persia, one from India, ones that I've never heard of before that also provide a testament to the oracular structure of truth, beyond just the Western examples. It's an extremely interesting intervention. I'd highly recommend you guys look at it.
Daniel, I sense something like Nietzschean with regard to truth, and that like, are you referring to like that meaning is, or like that all knowledge is like metaphorical from like on truth and lie in an extra moral sense?
No, no,
Or
no, 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 no,
it's
no, 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 no,
okay.
no, 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 not at
Something
all.
else. Okay.
Not at all. The point is that Freud um, further refines the idea that every subject is marked on their body with a signifier which determines their fate. That's the oracular structure, right? In the same way that Socrates could not but fulfill the oracle. It's this strange idea. Yeah, it's a deeply philosophical point. There's a few points in here where Lacan mentions it, we'll get to, where he shows that Freud's theory of the phallus, as well as Freud's, let's say, elementary theory of the signifier itself, reinforces some similar idea. We'll get to it later. Anyways, sorry for that digression, guys. Matan, I think we can begin. If I'm not mistaken, perhaps.
Well, you know what? Just because you happen to be talking about oracular knowledge, I think just going a couple paragraphs back to the bottom of 676, I think we get an interesting, we get Lacan's interesting insight into what Freud offers in terms of talking about oracular knowledge, particularly how he politicizes it in a way that I recognize as being different from Nietzsche, particularly by situating it, what is it here? In the cuts, quote, cuts offered it by actual discourse and the cogitation it informs.
Mhm.
So, you talk about self-censorship often. And I think there's something to do with the subversion of the duty to speak well happening here, situating the unconscious there, but let's just get right into it.
Well,
Oh,
that's
sure.
another thing. That's another thing, which is he says that Freud possesses knowledge of savoir, but does not possess knowledge as connaissance. And this is a distinction that we should review very closely, precisely what he means by that, because connaissance refers to what he defines as experimental knowledge, and he links it to the tradition of Descartes. So we need to, and then of course, savoir is a knowledge of well articulated speech, right? Which we remember is the plane or the kind of line of Lacanian ethics, is formulated off of savoir. On the one hand, on the other hand, we also remember that Lacan made a biting criticism of Marxist philosophy, which would attempt to reinforce a knowledge of savoir that would be in line with some kind of presupposition that the subject of savoir-faire would have access to total knowledge. Remember that whole point that he made, which is that the problem with Marxist philosophers is that they're trying to say that the liberation of the worker could come about through the worker themselves becoming a savant. And I actually think that a savant is precisely that, somebody that can speak well about anything, right?
Can they speak well about their own méconnaissance, their own misrecognitions? I think that's what,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think,
Well, that's actually the problem, which is they
mhm,
didn't have anything to say about that, which is why they ended up being dupes or stupid, right?
yeah,
So he said that it led to that, which is true to some extent. It's true to some extent. Anyways, I don't want to go into that whole thing. I'll get
certainly,
way too emotional with
yeah.
his criticism of Marxist intellectuals. Just kidding. Okay, please, by all means, please go.
In this formulation, the formulation I just repeated with the misrecognition and the cuts in actual discourse, in this formulation, which is mine only in the sense that it conforms as closely to Freud's texts as to the experience they opened up, The crucial term is the signifier, revived from ancient rhetoric by modern linguistics in a doctrine whose various stages I can't trace here, but of which the names de Saussure and Jacobson stand for its dawn and its present-day culmination, not forgetting that the pilot science of structuralism in the West has its roots in Russian formalism, which is where formalism first flourished. Geneva in 1910 and Petrograd in 1920 suffice to explain why Freud did not have this particular instrument at his disposal, but this historically motivated lacuna makes all the more instructive the fact that the mechanisms described by Freud as those of the primary process by which the unconscious is governed correspond exactly to the functions this school of linguistics believes determine the most radical axes of the effects of language, namely metaphor and metonymy. In other words, the effects of the substitution and combination of signifiers in the synchronic and diachronic dimensions, respectively, in which they appear in discourse. Once the structure of language is recognized in the unconscious, what sort of subject can we conceive of it, for it? In a concern for method, we can try to begin here with the strictly linguistic definition of I as signifier, where it is nothing but the shifter or indicative that, as grammatical subject of the statement, designates the subject insofar as he is currently speaking. Meaning, I can be myself, Matan, I can be Matilda, Andrew, anybody here, so long as they're the one enunciating it. That is to say, it designates the enunciating subject, but does not signify them. This is obvious from the fact that there may be no signifier of the enunciating subject in the statement. Not to mention that there are signifiers that differ from I, and not only those that are inadequately called cases of the first person singular, even if we add that it can be lodged in the plural invocation or even in the self of autosuggestion. I believe, for example, that I have detected the enunciating subject in the French signifier ne, said by grammarians to be expletive, a term that already prefigures the incredible opinion of those among the best who regard its form as subject to sheer whimsy. Would that the weight I give it make them think twice, before it not but become obvious they have missed the point? Take out the not but, before it become obvious they have missed the point. Take out that not but, and my enunciation loses its force as an attack, I alighting me in the impersonal. Yet I fear that in this way they could not but come to vilify me. Skip that not but and its absence, toning down my alleged fear to declare my repugnance to a timid assertion, reduces the emphasis of my enunciation by situating me in the statement. But if I say to kill because they are killing me, where am I situating myself if not in the kill on the basis of which I glare at them? Well, don't sulk. I am merely referring obliquely to what I am reluctant to cover over with the inevitable map of clinical work. Namely, the right way to answer the question, who is speaking when the subject of the unconscious is at stake, when a signifier represents the subject for another signifier. For the answer cannot come from him if he doesn't know what he is saying, or even that he is speaking, as all of analytic experience teaches us. Hence, the place of the interset, constituted by the intraset of a between two subjects, is the very place in which the transparency of the classical subject divides, undergoing, as it does, the effects of fading that specify the Freudian subject due to its occultation by an ever purer signifier. May these effects lead us to the frontiers where slips of the tongue and jokes become indistinguishable in their collusion, or even where elision is so much more elusive in driving presence back to its layer that we are astonished the hunt for Dasein hasn't made any more of it.
Okay, great. All right, I think this is a good point for us to discuss. Andrew, sorry, the not to, please jump in.
Yeah, no, this rereading 677 or pagination 800 a handful of times, there's a lot to be unpacked right here, even going to the last paragraph that Matan read on pagination 801. But it's key to point out that what Lacan is trying to get at with the notion of the signifier is that this is what governs as the primary process for Freud. And of course, he didn't have structural linguistics of his time. Lacan is pointing out that while he is borrowing the synchrony and diachrony from Saussure and metaphor and metonymy from Jacobson mainly, because you'll recall, I don't know how many people have read the Milner text, but I know you, Daniel, if you recall the whole thing about Stalin in linguistics, right? That there is, was it language does not change based upon the effects of infrastructure, and anything that changes in language is independent of infrastructure, right? And he will say that Jacobson kind of has a similar formulation in regards with language. Now, Lacan, other than like Foucault, will take on that only to point out really what he's dealing with in language is not some sort of science of linguistics, but really the focal point, which is the subject. That's why he says right here, once the structure of language is recognized in the unconscious, what sort of subject can we conceive of? It's a subject that tries to operate in the process of this metaphor metonymy that is not, unlike Jacobson, on the level of contiguity. And it is because of displacement and condensation as, governed by the pleasure principle of the unconscious that we are aiming our technique or our analytic investigation as. The last thing I want to say is this notion of the indexical, because like he says, right, like, and Matan pointed out, like the I or the pronoun, these indexicals, these designators are very synonymous to Hegel's the here, the now, the then, or the I. They point, but they do not give meaning in a differential setting like the signifier does, right? So like index is like we're on the road in the highway and you see the sign that says like exit 34 and there's an arrow. That points and index indicates that you're getting off the highway, but it doesn't give you any meaning about the highway itself. It's only when you see a sign that says White Castle, a Shell gas station, etc., that now you have a differential network of signifiers that relate to that index. So in the sense that I splits itself from pointing, that it's the subject speaking, and then the enunciation itself. So I think these are some key things to really think about when thinking about the process that is not contiguity, but within metaphor metonymy and the function of the signifier.
That's excellent. I don't know if others want to jump in. I think obviously the way that this section ended with this notion of the fading of the Freudian notion of the fading of the subject is going to be elaborated further, but I think we're getting into this very interesting notion that where the being of the subject is placed in relationship to the way that the signifier like splits their being. And this takes on a synchronous dimension whereby their being is now caught in the past, but a past which is present, right? So I think you could probably think about that through a lot of different ways that certain sentences might appear or rather be uttered or rather enunciated in analysis, in which you're bringing a certain traumatic scene, you're sort of like smuggling it into your sentence, and once it is, but what's interesting to me about that is that only the scansion can reveal like the fact of it in a certain way. Like in other words, it's not immediately apparent. How could it be, right? How could the subject of the unconscious immediately? No, it's not. It's not possible in a certain way. Although, if you do analysis long enough, it kind of does. That sort of like does become more in your measure, if that makes sense. To understand your slips, I think, is a certain type of knowledge as meconnaissance, which is extremely rich, you know?
Right. And that's what's
It,
important about that scansion, though, is that it stops like the lighting of signification in that shifting of the eye. The scansion is like that punctual moment, right? That keeps the chain from continuously going. It stops at that crucial point.
yeah, exactly. But I think that the interesting thing about these examples is how pedestrian they are. I'm talking about the ones on 677. So you see, they're pedestrian in the sense that they're not necessarily talking about, like, even though they are not illustrative of examples of speech in which a repressed desire is necessarily functioning, still nonetheless, this is the constitutive basis of all speech and meaning making as such. So what I like about this is that it's being sort of framed like that, as opposed to in strong examples or in only in analytic examples, or you see my point. And I think once we get to the first portrayal of the graph, we'll get a clearer sense of how that is actually functioning, because it only makes sense to fully map it along this notion of signifying chain, and how the signifier also is a point of a kind of interruption. It's a kind of interruption within the sentence, which doesn't always necessarily need to be sort of like located, but it's almost like always located when it is sort of misapplied in a certain way. And it can be misapplied usually phonemically, but it can also be misapplied in the application of the thing to the wrong thing, like the example that he uses later of the child mistaking a dog for meowing and a cat for barking as the proof of the logic of the signifier in the air. Go ahead. Who's next? Somebody had a hand up.
I had a hand up, but it was just I wanted to throw out like navel of the dream, like in the I think when this thing about the ever purer occultation of the signifier, sort of in Freud, and this kind of like throwaway reference to like Heidegger. And I mean, again, I haven't read any Heidegger, but I hear that there's this like the withdrawal of the object, right? Like how
Right.
like however you approach the object, something about it like recedes from view. And that, I mean, and something about the navel of the dream as this like after all of the analysis, what you arrive at is something that's like unanalyzable. Like that's just, it's just the navel. It doesn't have sense, meaning, you know what I mean? Like, and in that sense, it seems somewhat like it's like pure signifier in the sense like it's just like the word of God, right? Like it doesn't really matter what the word means. It's just the word, right? Like, you know, that's how I was interpreting it.
Yeah, it's almost like these sort of traces uh, of this of the Freudian insight indicates that each subject possesses these sort of traces of primal signifiers, which riddle their speech and displace the temporality of their capacity to make meaning by always retethering their meaning, at least partially, not fully, in the place of where they are not. Yeah. And this introduces this division of being and non-being, which we will elaborate. And once we get to page 679, we get some extremely dense formulas for this, but I think that they're actually quite sensible. So let's forge ahead, because he's also sort of telegraphing more to come here.
Lest our hunt be in vain, we analysts must bring everything back to the cut as function in discourse, the most significant being the cut that constitutes a bar between the signifier and the signified. Here we come upon the subject who interests us, since, being bound up in signification, he seems to be lodging in the preconscious. This would lead us to the paradox of conceiving that discourse in an analytic session is worthwhile only insofar as it stumbles or even interrupts itself. Were not the session itself instituted as a break in a false discourse, that is, in what discourse realizes when it becomes empty as speech, when it is no more than the worn coinage Mahomet speaks of, that is passed from hand to hand in silence. The cut made by the signifying chain is the only cut that verifies the structure of the subject as a discontinuity in the real. If linguistics enables us to see the signifier as the determinate of the signified, analysis reveals the truth of this relationship by making holes in the meaning in meaning the determinants of its discourse. This is the path by which an imperative can be fulfilled. The imperative Freud raised to the sublime stature of a pre-Socratic knowing.
This is what I mean by oracular, by the way. Everything I said about oracular is tied to this vo es vor sol ik werden, this where it was, the I shall come to be.
Mhm.
Yeah. I like that he calls it imperative, by the way, because that's Kantian. So, okay. Please.
The formula, yeah, as you said, voice vowel solik werden, which I have commented upon more than once, and which I am now going to inflect differently. I will limit myself to examining one step in its grammar, where it was, la ou se fou. What does that mean? If it were but this se that might have been, to use the aoristic form, how to come to the same place in order to make myself be there by stating it now. But the French translation says la ou c'est ta. Let us take advantage of the distinct imperfect it provides. Where it was just now, where it was for a short while, between an extinction that is still glowing and an opening that stumbles, I can come into being by disappearing from my statement. An enunciation that denounces itself, a statement that renounces itself, an ignorance that sweeps itself away, an opportunity that self-destructs. What remains here, if not the trace of what really must be in order to fall away from being? A dream, related by Freud in his article Formulations on the Two Principles of Mental Functioning, gives us a sentence related to the pathos with which the figure of a dead father returning as a ghost would be invested. He did not know he was dead. That happened in a dream of mine, by the way. I have already used this sentence to illustrate the subject's relation to the signifier through an enunciation that makes a human being tremble due to the vacillation that comes back to him from his own statement. If this figure of the dead father subsists only by virtue of the fact that one does not tell him the truth of which he is unaware, what then is the status of the I on which this subsistence depends? He did not know. He was to know a bit later. Oh, may that never happen. May I die rather than have him know. Yes, that's how I get there, where it was to be. Who knew thus that I was dead? Being of non-being. That is how I comes on the scene as a subject who is conjugated with the double aporia of a veritable subsistence that is abolished by his knowledge and by a discourse in which it is death that sustains existence. Will we weigh this being against the being Hegel as subject forged? Hegel being the subject who, regarding history, adopts the discourse of absolute knowledge. He's asking, is absolute knowledge the knowledge of being the coyote running in place before you look down, realize you're off of a cliff, and then you fall? We recall that Hegel admitted to having experienced the temptation of madness. Isn't our path the one that overcomes that by going right to the truth of the vanity of this discourse? I will not expound my doctrine on madness here, for I have included this eschatological excursion only to designate the gap that separates the two relations, Freudian and Hegelian, between subject and knowledge, and to show that there is no surer root of these relations than the different ways in which the dialectic of desire is distinguished in them. For in Hegel's work, it is desire that is given responsibility for the minimal link the subject must retain to antiquity's knowledge if truth is to be imminent in the realization of knowledge. The cunning of reason means that from the outset and right to the end, the subject knows what he wants and can kind of, reinterpret things to continually fit that. It is here that Freud reopens the junction between truth and knowledge to the mobility out of which revolutions arise. In this respect, that desire becomes bound up at that junction with the other's desire, that the desire to know lies in this loop. Freud's biologism has nothing to do with the preachy abjection that wafts up to us from psychoanalytic headquarters. And you had to be made to experience the death instinct, which is held in such abomination there, to get on the true wavelength of Freud's biology. For to avoid the death instinct in his doctrine is not to know his doctrine at all. On the basis of the approach I've created for you, you should recognize in the metaphor of the return to the inanimate, which Freud ascribes to every living body, the margin beyond life that language assures the human being of due to the fact that he speaks, and which is precisely the margin where this being places in signifying position. Not
Okay.
only
Sorry. I think we should go back quickly to understand this little paragraph, which reads, being of non-being, that is how I comes on the scene as a subject, who's conjugated with a double aporia of a veritable subsistence that is abolished by his knowledge and by a discourse in which it is death that sustains existence. I think that has to be read in relationship to the prior example of he did not know he was dead, in the sense that that example from Freud, from formulations on the two principles of mental functioning, explains how the abolishment of knowledge itself functions in the symbolic. So that's one point. I think the other point that we would have to interrogate is why, hold on a second. What is it that you want, honey? Oh, go ahead. We would have to interrogate also why it is that the discourse in which death sustains existence. Here's an interesting point about that, I think, because this notion of Freud as discovering something revolutionary in discourse, we already saw that in seminar 16. And I think it has to do with every time Freud has talked about vis-a-vis the theory of discourses, is the idea that Freud discovered the analyst discourse. And I think that there's something about the mediation of the analyst discourse to philosophy, to Hegel, to this idea of the absolute, that allows for that to be rethought, i.e. to be thought, for revolution to be thought. All of this question about death that sustains existence is, I think, this reference to the Heideggerian theory of Dasein. I would ask you guys, how do you understand that latter part of the sentence, of this notion of death sustaining existence? To me, in a certain way, you could say that it has to do with the way that the signifier promotes this theory of the fading or of the erasure of the subject. That it not only does it split them, but the question that I'm wondering is the status of death itself. I think we should think about this further. Akshay, please.
I was going to say that like Lacan at various other points kind of like equivocates between signifier and death, and sort of like, in the sense that when you have a signifier, you're sort of expendable now, right? Like you're replaced. And I think there's like that equivocation with like replacement in all of its senses, like to be replaced by your child.
Right.
And quite literally that's it, you're expendable now, right? Like in this kind of like sense of, I mean, so yeah, actually that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll stop.
Well, no, I suppose that it does, because it's like once you have the cut between signifier and signified, the placement of the subject never has a harmonious possibility for placement or something like that, which is the heart of what psychoanalysis teaches to the Freudian theory of the subject qua absolute, in a certain way. Go ahead, the Natsu, please.
We both have something, but Ellie will go first. We'll go first.
Well, I guess first of all, this evokes Seminar 7 and what he talks about when he's talking about Antigone and the between two deaths to me. But also during supervision today, it actually came up, and I thought it was kind of an interesting take. We were talking about suicidal ideation in a client, and my supervisor made the comment that um, a comment such as "I don't want to be here anymore" in a clinical sense indicates desire and a desire to live in kind of a backwards manner, in that they don't want to be here, meaning in the current space of suffering that they're in, but they might want to be there where there is no suffering. And so I guess it makes me think about that dialectic then between life and death, and how by naming one, you also are kind of endorsing the other, if that makes sense, or evoking the other.
That's very good. Yeah, I think this is good. It's interesting that he refers to antiquities knowledge, which again I think we can reflect back on this general notion of the oracular. Another word for the oracular would also be occultation, that he uses on 678. Right? This notion that desire has a kind of circularity to it. Desire has a circularity to it, which is that is extremely important and extremely well tested and well verified. That is the meaning of the oracular thing itself, which is the subject sort of gets back their desire through the dialectic of desire itself. And this is, well, this is what he calls the cunning of reason itself, right? For the subject from beginning to end knows what he or she wants. That's the pulsional, that's what like is the pulsional force of desire itself. That's also the truth of desire, but this desire is bound up with two types of knowledge, right? Which we will get to in a moment. Knowledge which dupes the subject, and knowledge which is bound up with their speech. Yeah. So yes, did you, Andrew, did you have a point to make as well? Please,
yeah,
please,
this
please.
is back to this knowledge in their speech, which is the sort of, I think you will even tie it in when it comes with jouissance as non-knowledge in the later seminars, but the sort of, just to stick within the 1950s to early 60s Lacan of the the knowledge that they refuse to acknowledge, or the knowledge that in which they ask a question but don't want to know the answer,
But it's also, yes, exactly. But it's also knowledge of the what he said just a moment ago of the nonsense, which is the only, what did he call it? A paradox of the psychoanalytic session is found in the fact that the most productive thing that can happen is the subject speaks nonsense.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say about a death, because he'll say these things that like the signifier cannot give any meaning to existential questions of life and death, but it's interesting how symbolically death has a sort of place, a designator, and thanks to, even before psychoanalysis, religion. And he even says something about like thanks to Christianity, death takes on a new meaning through the resurrection of Christ, right? Life renewed. But life itself is something, no matter how many, no matter the signifier, cannot really be predicated to mean something. In fact, it's like it does everything but the total opposite. And to which Lacan will say that he wants to separate being and existence. Like existence is not the same thing as being, and that's precisely because of the signifier. You could be dead, but your being still persists at the level of the name as a signifier, right? So I think that kind of ties something in when we think of, like, again, Hamlet, the father's being still persists as the sort of voice or apparition that haunts Hamlet via the signifier of,
in an imaginary identification.
Right.
But there's also the symbolic nature of what you might contribute that remains beyond death.
Yes, exactly. And that's the point about like the way the signifier functions of death prior to life. Sam McCormick says that life, capital L, is actually something of the level of the real, which I think quite interesting. I think he tries to align that with sort of jouissance, right? As like sort of
yeah. Well, we know like a general point regarding the definition of a signifier in the Lacanian sense of it is that it is like the opposite of the biological field. And I think that that's interesting because therefore it constitutes a different theory of death
Yes.
from biological death. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to focus on how we understand what he's meaning here by death. And Andrew is very, very correct to point to this split between being and existence. And it's not to say that Lacan is Sartrean. I don't think, apropos the primacy of one over the other, although we can get to that in a moment. I think as we elaborate through this further, we could actually go back and see how Lacan might relate to the Sartrean principle of the primacy of existence. Jonas, please.
Hello. So, everyone's already said basically everything that could be said. So I'll just share a little story, little exchange I had on Twitter. Someone said something like, "It's really astounding how biological determinism is today's dominant ideology. Everything is firing synapses," in quotes. A truly vulgar materialism that cannot think the radical negativity of the unconscious, cannot think the rupture of the event, cannot think the intimacy of spirit. And the fact that it's so squarely opposed to biodeterminism is kind of interesting because it's like you keep biodeterminism around just as the guarantor, as it's the thing that can't say what is negative. You know? Not that it ever actually wanted to, you know, it's like it fails at something it wasn't trying to fail at. You know? I mean, this is kind of my general stance on, I mean, Lacan's very clear about like, this isn't biology. But I think a lot of readers of Lacan will say that, like, well, that means we have to reject biology. No, biology isn't the thing to reject. You know, we hold on to it. It's like it becomes the dominant ideology, not by the people who think we can tell you everything with biology. It's by the people who say you can't tell me everything with biology. You know, it's that negative belief. So just a thought I had.
No, that's extremely helpful. Thank you for that. Yeah, it reminds me of the conception of nature in Lacan, and it is always a mystery to me how one derives a theory of nature from the Cartesian tradition more generally. Right? Like, in other words, you know that like silly cliche that a lot of people who haven't read a lot of philosophy always say about like how Cartesian dualism is responsible for Eurocentrism, or Cartesian dualism is responsible for the propensity for rationality to despise nature, or something like that. I mean, one can see how these stereotypes emerge, right? But still, nonetheless, there does seem to be a polemical thrust happening here against primarily a conception of the death drive, which would be overly biologistic. Yeah. And I think we are aware generally of who the culprits are of this conception. I think the more interesting thing to conclude from that is like, yeah, like we need to be clear, like why Lacan is so adamantly opposed to doing that. Akshay, please.
Just the Descartes thing, I mean, it's worth remembering that he thought animals were literally machines. So it's like, for him, nature is also a machine. But it's not biology, it's archaeology, in the sense that it's like, if you think about burial, like when does the corpse become a corpse? Like, in the sense that it signifies the absence of a living person. So that's death, right? Like, as opposed to like, okay, a dog just died and it's just, you know what I mean? There's no there's no mourning over this, oh, this dog, it should have life in it. Where's the life? We need to mark this with like a burial site, like, and that is the signifier, right? Because what the signifier does is that it makes present an absence. And so, I mean, yeah, those are just some thoughts I had in relation to what Andrew and Jonas were saying.
That's extremely helpful. This making presence of an absence is extremely spot on.
If I could just interrupt for a second, I just thought that was interesting because yeah, there's two ways of like honoring somebody in name or quote unquote honoring. There's the actual honoring where you in somehow ritualize it, but then there's also the circulation of sexual rumors after the fact. I mean, all this talk has reminded me of Finnegan's Wake, which begins with the wake of Finnegan. This guy just dies ignominiously, falls off a ladder, and the rest of the book is like, or a lot of it is just kind of making fun of one specific sexual embarrassment that this person had in their life.
Very nice. Thank you for that. Matilda, please.
I wondered if the death referred to, I guess, this idea from like Kant with Sod that like we are, I guess, both like a subject from one point of view and an object from another. Like as we approach the pure, I guess maybe the pure signifier, like, or as we approach like the imperative or something, we become an object, if I remember correctly from our last reading, like having to do with like the split or whatever, and maybe a connection to death with regard to like becoming an object, rather than like our, like, you know, our subjecthood dying in some way. I don't know if that's a correct way of approaching the death here. And I think it's interesting that like, basically it seems like what we just read, like Lacan starts with like the death, like he basically like says like, okay, our method here is to talk about like the I as like a piece of language. And we see that it has like two parts to it. And we end up with this like double aporia. And as I guess, I don't know. I don't have much else to say.
No, I think the other valence and angle by which we can invoke the meaning of death, my analysts always reminds me of the fact that Hegel, in essence, put forward something like the kind of dialectical necessity of ego death, and that the Lacanian theory of the imaginary is itself a process in miniature, right, of the battle for prestige, which is the battle for death, the right. So that could be understood as the shedding of one's own youthful image, right, which we all must do and must undergo, and which we do. And so that there's that also kind of dialectical imaginary I, the imaginary I, as undergoing a type of annihilation in a certain way. I think might be another way to get at this. Elizabeth, please.
I kind of read this passage, the being of non-being through death that sustains existence, as pointing to the subversion of the subject that Lacan wants to address. Insofar as it gets at like the subject of the unconscious is the subject of, or a subject as intrinsically bound and subordinated to the clearly autonomous operation of the signifier. So the subject of the unconscious is only a function of the signifier that determines it. And I read that as like the subversion.
Very nice.
Yeah.
100%. Yes, exactly. We forget the importance of the concept of subversion here. It's bound up with this. This is such an important little passage that it's extremely bound up in the very center of it. Yes. And then, yes, and then this question of the determination for Hegel is found in the work of desire. It's what he says links Hegel to antiquities knowledge. So I think perhaps, Matan, it's a good time for you to kick it back off. Could you begin? Actually, why don't you just kick it off where you left off? Actually, I don't remember exactly where it was.
Being of non-being. I'm on page 679, 2/3 of the, or one third of the way through. Being of non-being. That is how I comes on the scene as a subject who is conjugated with the double aporia of a veritable subsistence that is abolished by his knowledge and by
Hey,
discourse.
Matan.
I thought we
Yeah.
stopped at the part on 680 when he was just talking
Absolutely.
about inanimate life.
Yes.
Yeah, we are. I would propose that we move down to Freud's biologism, and then just kind of take it from there.
Freud's biologism has nothing to do with the preachy objection that wafts up to us from psychoanalytic headquarters. And you had to be made, please, go ahead. No, okay. And you had to be made to experience the death instinct, which is held in such abomination, dude. To get on
You
the
know, it's so funny. He's so fucking clever. Freud's biologism had nothing to do with the preachy abjection that wafts. He's like making a reference, I think, to like the scientific invocation of legitimizing psychoanalysis vis-a-vis biologism as somehow turning into a type of bad religion or something. Anyways, go on.
Well, it's almost like what's his name in his Organon project.
Yeah, right.
Like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
well, right.
Well, yeah, it could be a reference to that. Although that is so ludicrous, it may not even be worth mentioning. He never mentions Wilhelm Reich by name. He never would.
Yep. There's also the death of the organs, which carry a peculiar rotten smell.
Yeah.
And you had to be made to experience the death instinct, which is held in such abomination there to get on the true wavelength of Freud's biology. For to evade the death instinct in his doctrine is not to know his doctrine at all. On the basis of the approach I have prepared for you, you should recognize in the metaphor of the return to the inanimate, which Freud ascribes to every living body, the margin beyond life that language assures the human being of due to the fact that he speaks, and which is precisely the margin where this being places in signifying position not only those parts of his body that lend themselves to this because they are exchangeable, but the body itself. Thus, it becomes apparent that the object's relation to the body can in no way be defined as based on a partial identification that would have to be totalized there, since, on the contrary, this object is the prototype of the body's signifierness as the human being's anti. Here I will
Anti is like is that a reference to the Pascalian wager?
Is just end, like death corpse. Like the anterior.
Is that right? I see.
Well, it's a double entendre.
I thought
It's
that
a
it
wager.
was I
Yeah.
thought it
Right,
was a
so up the
reference.
ante as well. Like no, you're totally right. I'm just
No, you see my point. It's this notion that the subject comes into fruition, yeah, through subversion and so on, but it's not adequately developed in psychoanalytic. Well, really, it's kind of metapsychology, let's call it more precisely. Like if you're writing an academic paper about it, I think it's actually he's making a commentary on metapsychology, I think, in some sense. That also necessitates a wager or yeah, but that's a separate thing. Sorry. That's please continue.
Here I will take up the challenge made to me when people translate as instinct what Freud calls trieb, which drive would seem to translate quite well into English, but which is avoided in the standard edition of his works. In French, my last resort would be dériver, drift. If I were unable to give the bastardized term pulsion, drive, or urge its point of impact, and so I insist on promoting the idea that, whether grounded or not, in biological observation, instinct among the modes of knowledge required by nature of living beings so that they satisfy its needs, is defined as a kind of experiential knowledge we admire because it cannot become articulated knowledge. But in Freud's work, something quite different is at stake, which is a savoir, certainly a knowledge, but an articulated knowledge, but one that doesn't involve the slightest knowledge, in that it is inscribed in a discourse of which the subject who, like the messenger slave of antiquity, carries under his hair the codicil that condemns him to death, knows neither the meaning nor the text, nor in what language it is written, nor even that it was tattooed on his shaven scalp while he was sleeping. This apologue barely exaggerates just how little the unconscious has to do with physiology. This can be gauged by cross-checking the contribution made by psychoanalysis to physiology since its inception. Nothing, even as far as the sexual organs are concerned. No amount of fabulation will prevail against this balance sheet. For, of course, psychoanalysis concerns the reality of the body and of its imaginary mental schema, but to recognize their import in the perspective authorized by quote-unquote development, we must first realize that the more or less fragmented integrations that seem to account for the order of development function first and foremost like elements of a heraldry of the body. This is confirmed by the use that is made of them in reading children's drawings.
Okay. See, again, this is why I think this whole notion of oracular is so significant, because what he's really saying here is that if you look at the case studies of Freud and Freud's wider theory of the death drive, there is a kind of determinism that's capable of being located within the psychic reality of any given subject, that can be brought out, that their desire can be pinpointed to it, right? And I also would say there's a historicist claim going on here, which is not fully developed in this text, but in other Lacanian texts it is developed, which is that psychoanalysis is losing that same capacity to locate determine signifiers in a certain way or something like that. That's a whole other thing I don't want to get into, but I just find this whole passage super interesting. In some ways, Lacan is kind of coming on hot. He's very coming on strong. Where I would push back on Lacan is that it would be nice if Lacan would actually be elucidating a few examples from Freud's to demonstrate this more would be nice. Go ahead, Andrew and Ellie.
Yeah, no, that is a good question. I do like this subtle point though that he makes about Trieb and what
Yeah.
alive with Totus Trieb is the notion of derive or drift, which he wants to use as an alternative to the bastardization of this vitalist notion of pulsion. Because I think in French, like they would use like pousser or something like that. I forget with the French, but the point being is that why he prefers this, because again, what are the constitutions of the drive? You have a source, aim, an object, and then I forget the other one. But why the drift is so important is because it has everything to do with not only object but aim, and that it's something that's elided and yet at the same time still gets the same or similar satisfaction as it would if it were to achieve the aim of the object, right? Which puts into question the theory of not only sublimation but also the purpose of the function of the death drive, right? And it's sort of return to inanimate a matter, or the inanimate, not like as in like death, but as in something that is sort of, maybe we could use artificial, something that goes beyond biology, which has to do with the signifying function, right?
Well, yeah, and then in a moment he makes a reference to the theory of the phallus,
Yeah,
as
species in
sort
there.
of, well, yeah, but also as something like that can be like marked on the subject, such that the subject knows neither the meaning nor the text, nor in what
Yeah.
language it is written, nor even that it was tattooed on his shaven scalp while he was sleeping, right? So
Yeah.
he's talking about how the signifier marks the body and how that uh, uh, relates to the constitution of the subject as a subject of the drives. But I think we need to continue to fully pinpoint this question.
I wonder if this is also sort of criticism of the criticism of Lacan by Laplanche, who criticizes drift, and that passage which you just quoted about the slave
Yeah,
is the messenger, right? Um,
yeah,
and Luis, I think it was Luis that put master's knowledge versus slave's knowledge. To Lacanianize that more, I think what Luis just pointed out is the fact that, yeah, as you said, there is a marking on the subject that does not know the language.
and the other thing of the marking is, of course, the name of the father.
Yes.
Because one indication there is that heraldry.
Yeah, but the main thing, and of course we'll get into this later, but the subject, or in this case the slave, is on the side of the message, whereas the other is on the side of the code that needs to be deciphered. And I think that is the big distinction that we'll see play out later on, right? As that a message is always something that is not only received in inverted form, but has to be something sort of interpreted from a code that is mysterious on the side of the other.
Oh yeah, that's the codicil. Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. Yeah, that's because that's like Freud's innovation, right? Which is that Lacan is kind of saying that like Hegel doesn't really have an adequate theory of the other in his saga of the dialectic of desire, right? And that the Freudian unconscious gives us a proper placement of the other in line with the Freudian theory of desire and the dialectic of desire, right? I think that's extremely useful. But I think this other point, though, is it's like I think there's a lot of ways you can think about this notion of either through a theory of the mark, through name of the father, but also through like the what Matilda called of like pure signifier. I think there's a wealth of examples that would come to mind in terms of how all of that works. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah. We're moving on to like a comparison with Hegel and the Freudian subject, and it looks like the Freudian subject reopens a junction between truth and knowledge. And I guess, in the Hegelian one, I guess Hegel proposed a system like in which truth could become immanent in knowledge, or truth could become immanent in consciousness, like the subject could know its truth at some point. And in Freud, it seems like
What
there's
are
a
you
junction.
what are you referring to that the subject can know its truth?
In the Hegelian subject, that there's like
Oh yeah.
in the path of history, like truth can become like immanent in knowledge, and knowledge can mean like kind of like two things, like consciousness, which it probably has to do with in Hegel or savoir, and with Freud, it's he kind of I think is basically excluding the idea that truth can become immanent in knowledge, and that this is a revolution in the sense that it harms human narcissism. Like, I'm just proposing that idea that this use of revolution here refers back to the Copernican one, where a true revolution is one that like kind of shatters the like human narcissism in some way.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't refer back. You're right. I was initially thinking it might refer back to Lacan's comments on Marxism and revolution, but I think it actually refers to science, the revolution in science.
I think that's possible, and
No, I think you're right. That is more productive.
okay. And just to finish what I was thinking here is, it seems like Freud's the way that, like, I guess truth's relation, I guess truth still has a relationship to knowledge, but it's not one that can become immanent within knowledge. And he specifies that, like, for Freud, and I think maybe this transition to instinct here in the death drive is that, like, that for Freud, what is at stake is savoir, but not consciousness, and that truth becomes immanent within savoir in this very strange way that seems difficult to notice, I guess, to say kind of in a sketchy way. I'm a bit confused still about the paragraph above, about the body and the object. The object's relation to the body. The object there, that as a term just kind of comes out of nowhere, and I can't really track where it's coming
Where are you at
from.
exactly?
The top of 680. The margin. So he makes this turn towards the death instinct after distinguishing Freud from Hegel, because I guess maybe the death instinct has to do with the exclusion of truth becoming immanent in knowledge.
Yeah.
Perhaps this decentering, I guess that would make sense with regard to the term revolution. And anyway, it would take a while to reread this paragraph, but I am confused about, like, so, like, there's a margin beyond life due to the signifier, from which somehow the whole human can become put up as an anti, or
right.
And this object is in fact, it's the prototype for the body. And maybe that's the part object, or
I don't think it's the part object. I
Okay,
think it's like a reference to this point of the erogenous zones of the body and the theory of the partial object. In his wider debate with Melanie Klein about that, and how we can derive a theory of subjecthood, or whatever object, that will have dealt with this problem of not being a totalized subject, but also have what is the mechanism or the means by which one has unified the image of oneself, as we saw in the mirror stage essay, if you guys have ever read it, I think becomes something that is in the background here as the basis by which the subject, and yes, it is split, as you say, prototype, which is already a testament to what we saw on the last page about the aporia as like a tunis throughout the split subject, being in existence, etc. Right? So I think that would be I mean, I grant you, Matilda, and I think you are definitely like making some excellent points. But I think that yeah, Jonas, jump in.
I forget what I was saying. Never mind.
Okay, then let us forge ahead. I do agree, though, that the concept of object somewhat comes out of the blue in that paragraph. My interpretation of it would be this idea of what the subject is after the cut, after subversion. And
well, just to kind of put context to the object, it would just still fall into the level of metonymy. So anything metonymic within that chain.
Yeah, once we get to the graph, I think that would also help us place it. Absolutely. Let's forge ahead. I think we are now at.
We should be at the top of 681. This time I did keep track.
Can you go back to this apologue barely exaggerates and then go?
This apologue barely exaggerates just how little the unconscious has to do with physiology. This can be gauged by cross-checking the contribution made by psychoanalysis to physiology since its inception, which is 0, and no amount of fabulation will prevail against this balance sheet. 4, of course, psychoanalysis concerns the reality of the body and of its imaginary mental schema. But to recognize their import in the perspective authorized by development, we must first realize that the more or less fragmented integrations that seem to account for the order of development function first and foremost like elements of a heraldry of the body. This is confirmed by the use that is made of them in reading children's drawings. That's an interesting parallel, by the way, the double entry balance sheet and a child's drawings. But anyways, this is the crux to which I shall return later. Of the paradoxical privilege the phallus continues to have in the unconscious dialectic, the theory of the part object not sufficing to explain it. Need I now say, if one understands the kind of support I have sought in Hegel's work by which to criticize a degradation of psychoanalysis that is so inept that it has no other claim to fame than that of being contemporary, that it is inadmissible that I should be accused of having been lured by a purely dialectical exhaustion of being, and that I can but hold a particular philosopher responsible for authorizing this misunderstanding.
The reference there is not important. It's just obscure to a friend of his who's a Hegelian. I thought that he was going to be to like Kojev or to it's not. But anyways, go on.
For far from giving myself over to some logicizing reduction where desire is at stake, I detect in desire's irreducibility to demand the very mainspring of what also prevents it from being reduced to need. To put it elliptically, it is precisely because desire is articulated that it is not articulable, by which I mean in the discourse that suits it, an ethical, not a psychological discourse, because the satisfaction of desire is met with the end of that desire. I must now lay out the end of its articulation, unless there's some, this isn't really being addressed, there's some kind of like external motivating factor that is perpetuating this discourse that is purely at the level of like machinery. But anyways, I must now lay out for you in much greater detail the topology that I have developed in my teaching over the past few years, that is, introduce a certain graph which, I should indicate, also serves purposes other than the one I have in mind here, having been constructed and perfected quite explicitly in order to map out on its different levels the most broadly practical structure of the data of analytic experience. It will serve here to show where desire is situated in relation to a subject defined on the basis of his articulation by the signifier. And so we have graph 1 here. If everybody can look at it.
Yeah, the first graph.
Yes. And basically it's a arcing arrow indicating some sort of path. We have S prime.
Yeah.
And we have something interrupting it, which begins interrupting it from the end and then interrupt it again from the beginning of the arc. Andrew, you said, yeah, of course.
Yeah, may I add? So yeah, like and if you all remember in seminar 16, Chris Menor, the Bedouin guy, he really broke this down really nicely. So the arrow horizontally arcing that goes from left to right, S and S prime, which just S prime just means that it's just a notation of a chain of signifiers. It doesn't mean, oh, you got S and an S prime. It's a chain. And that just means that it's constituted discourse. And this is constituted discourse based on the chain of signifiers that allows for not only the everyday discourse that we are embedded in of language, but also that from the chain of speech, which produces the signifier, allows for the sliding of metaphor and metonymy, as well as diachrony and synchrony, because with this, there is a time factor to that. The completion of a sentence retroactively allows for that. At the bottom, you have delta, which intersects and produces the split subject, or the subject, as beautifully as Elizabeth said, is subverted because they are determined by the signifier or the autonomy of the signifier. And so need, and of course I put in my meme that I shared in the group chat, that need, of course, is filtered and channeled by demand. So it's not just need, it's need that funnels by demand. If you look, this is not two arcs of one going up and down and one going out. You have at least four. You have 4 points, or sorry, 6 points. The delta and the bar S and the S and S prime are 4 points, and then the 2 points would be the intersections on the left and right hand side. So the side on the right where delta meets up at that corner, that is where the code is, and that's where you get demand, right? So we'll just leave it right there. So I'll just say that. So at that point, as soon as delta hits that horizontal arrow, we get need converting into demand via the code. And Lacan will say it's also point de capitan, cool team point. So we should see this as not as like something that happens when we're in childhood. This is a logical predecessor to understand the graph, just as well as the master's discourse. It's not something that happened in the beginning of history. It's a logical presupposition for any future understanding of the signifier.
The point de capiton, like Fink situates it such that the signifying chain is the fabric, and the thread is delta to Bardas. If that helps situate it for anybody.
Okay, great. So let's, I mean, he does do a nice job, I think, explaining it, which oftentimes Lacan puts diagrams and graphs and actually doesn't explain it. So he does fairly lucidly. And Andrew, I think that was excellent. I have a couple of questions regarding delta. And I think, you know, in a certain way, it's kind of like this point also means that none of this is recognizable to the subject unless there is a scansion. And that's where this whole operation of time comes into play vis-a-vis anticipation, right? So there's this, which I think is simply understood by the point at which the signifying chain is a point, not of a single signifier, but almost like a single signifier is also already like a battery of signifiers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just like the one, you know, but it performs a certain, and then of course this notion of point de capitan is very useful. Back in his seminar on the psychoses, you'll remember that this was Lacan's kind of attempt for understanding what was it, like the link between the imaginary and the symbolic, or like something kind of, you could say almost like an achievement of meaning. It's precisely what the psychotic is not able to find a rapport with, but it is like a rapport that takes place with a signifier for the subject, right?
Well, yeah, I wanted to add to that, Daniel, because it's interesting with that is that
But sorry, so one final thing. You see, in analysis, that would make sense regarding the difficulty of this, right? Because in some sense, we should never underestimate the uncanny feeling and effects that occur, and because it does feel a little like there's an element of paranoia. You know what I'm saying? Because if the signifier is speaking through you, you know, in a certain way.
yeah,
But then we should also not forget that Lacan is trying to situate this within enunciated sentences as well and statements, right? So he wants to say that this logic, and that for me, to be honest with you, is more difficult to grasp. It's easier for me to grasp this when I apply it to the clinical free association context. So anyways, Akshay, please.
No, so sort of on the same line, like I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I was reading recently a book called Marks of an Analysis, and I've been going to psychoanalysis.
Amazing book, by the way. Amazing book.
I
What
have
book
to
was
say, I
this?
sort of hated it, like just because like the incredibly smug tone of like, ah, yes, we've been analyzed, and it made me reel a little bit. But what was I going to say? I really like the. I'm so sorry, Andrew. I didn't mean to. But I mean, I'm sure it's a great book. I just like tonally did not. But this line about that precisely because desire is articulated, that it is not articulable. And I mean, like, I think part of what you were just saying, Daniel, about this uncanny sense, it's because it's not the ego or I sort of setting out with its desire, but sort of like seeing the writing of destiny, like already there, you know, and like, I think to me, it brings up a lot of this like container contained kind of metaphors, analogy, but in the sense like sort of it's not your desire, right? Like it's desires you, like in some sense, or sort of like,
No,
yeah.
I think this is why Andrew said it's useful to go back to seminar 4, where the 4 stages of the Oedipus uh, structure or complex are developed, where we get for the infant, where we find that, and we'll see this in the more robust graph later, that desire also is something that is imparted from the parents and is therefore mimed or mimicked and repeated. And I think that goes back to this notion of heraldry, right?
But it's he also has this line where he's like, "Oh, it's not because your father's a knave that you'll be a knave, right?" Like maybe this is 16, I forget where, but like, but sort of whoever marks you, you know,
Right.
if they're a knave, you sort of, but sort of this, and it's this interesting notion of destiny there, right, which I thought, I mean,
Oh,
destiny,
absolutely.
destination, and the letter, and you know, like the whole Poe short story is the because that's you know, it's all about this like the letter arriving at its destination, right? Like in a sort of. But I'll stop.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Yes, please, Andrew and Ellie, please.
Yeah, no, like regarding that book, like I think it's good. Like CFAR does a lot of good stuff that brings a lot of stuff into clinical context. But I think the problem is, and this is, I think, because a lot of us are very rigorous with our intellectual stuff, that I feel like our standards as intellectuals, as Marxists, kind of exceed some of the rigor that a lot of these Lacanian texts really lack. But so I do understand your
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to,
yeah
they're always having to
yeah
address practical,
yeah.
but one thing that they do though in the French Parisian world is they do often make a kind of implicit claim, that, like, I'll summarize it by a phrase that I heard a Lacanian say once, which bothered me, and of course I'll keep it anonymous. They said that I can always tell when somebody's been analyzed versus somebody who hasn't.
That's pretty
Like,
smug.
that's so the worst, you know? But a lot of people believe that.
Yeah, no, it's so weird. But Daniel, like one of the things that's interesting, which you brought up about the whole point of like not like the quilting point in seminar 3, and it's not to say that Schreiber can't rationalize, of course he can, but it doesn't exceed the point of the constant metonymy, and he lacks the time factor that, let's say, the quote unquote neurotic has. And why I mention this, because the arrow of the delta and the barred S, that vector, right, is what Lacan will label in seminar 5 at the beginning. Mind you, he only uses this, I mean, not say he only uses, but he introduces this in the Familionaire chapter. He calls it the rationalist discourse, because this is what the subject of the need into demand is doing, is rationalizing the already arrow of articulated discourse within metaphor and metonymy, and the sliding and the lighting of the signifiers, which would thus create a punctual moment that is scansion worthy. And the example is, of course, when Heinrich Heine's character is told by, was it Solomon Rothschild? What does he say? He says, Solomon Rothschild says, I am a lottery agent myself from the Rothschild's lottery. I do not want any of my colleagues of mine in the kitchen. And Hirsch Hyacinth, the character of Heinz, says, he treated me in a quite familiar manner. This happens because this is a rationalization of that arrow of need that meets demand into an already articulated line of discourse that allows for the sliding of metaphor and metonymy, or something of a creation of a witticism to and it doesn't have to be that. It's the fact is that the quilting point or point de capiton could not happen without both arrows, right? That's the
Thank you very much for that. That's extremely helpful review of the first graph of desire, which we're familiar with from our seminar 16 reference. Matilda, and then we will go back to reading.
Yeah. The paragraph above where it says like, because desire is articulated, it is not articulable in an ethical discourse.
Yeah, that goes back to this notion that ethics for Lacan is found in savoir, it's found in articulated speech.
Okay,
That's its domain.
I guess what it brought up for me was like the ethical. I don't exactly know what discourse it's referring to yet, but
if I can add, I think it's not referring to discourse, but alienation from discourse through speech. And I think that's something that's like kind of not being addressed in this first graph, and then he'll kind of make the second one to try to think about that.
Okay, just the associations it brought up for me was like from the Kant Avex side, like where when we approach the moral law, we see that desire seems to be on the side of this so there's the subject that has, in its imaginary sense, that has like an interest in these objects, but then as we approach the moral law, like the subject who was interested in the objects becomes an object for this thing that's speaking. Like we encounter pure signifiers, and it does seem like as we approach these pure signifiers, we also approach like desire and like the death drive, because following the moral law in these imperatives is like not pleasurable. It's seems related to like the death drive, and I guess in that sense, like desire is like related to this like this speaking imperative vanishing thing that doesn't have phenomenal qualities, and because it's desire is wrapped up in this speaking pure signifier thing, like signifiers can never be articulated in the sense of like A equals A. There's like somehow this inability for things that are subject to signifiers to find like a definition from them, from signifiers or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Which we would call a metonymic relation between them, no? I mean, I'm only confused in everything you say regarding this notion of pure signifier. I'm not sure why I have to qualify it that way. I'm only saying that because I think maybe you're saying that because Lacan had teased us along into this occult, ancient Greek, Freudian thing. And then he's also trying to be very quite demonstrative that all of this can be proven through like any sentence or something like that. So he's sort of working at two levels that don't seem too commensurate.
Yeah. I'm a little far away from where we actually are, so I apologize.
Oh, okay, sure. Let's go back to where we are and continue.
Could someone remind we've just begun talking about the
Why don't you just
here.
say, why don't you just go through, I must now lay out for you in much greater detail so we can just read through, why don't you just read through the description and then we can revisit it.
I must now lay out for you in much greater detail the topology that I have developed in my teaching over the past few years, that is, introduce a certain graph, which I should indicate also serves purposes other than the one I have in mind here, having been constructed and perfected quite explicitly in order to map out on its different levels the most broadly practical structure of the data of analytic experience. It will serve here to show where desire is situated in relation to a subject defined on the basis of his articulation by the signifier. Now here's what might be called its elementary cell. In it is articulated what I have called the button tie, the quilting point by which the signifier stops the otherwise indefinite sliding of signification. Signifying chain is assumed to be borne by the vector S to S prime without even going into the subtleties of the negatively oriented direction in which its double intersection with the vector delta to S bar occurs. Only in this latter vector does one see the fish it hooks, a fish less suitable for representing what it withdraws from our grasp in its vigorous swimming, than the intention that tries to drown it in the flood tide of pretext, namely the reality that is imagined in the ethological schema of the return of need. The diachronic function of this button tie can be found in a sentence, in so far as a sentence closes its signification only with its last term, each term being anticipated in the construction constituted by the other terms, and inversely sealing their meaning by its retroactive effect. But the synchronic structure is more hidden, and it is this structure that brings us to the beginning. It is metaphor insofar as the first attribution is constituted in it, the attribution that promulgates the dog goes meow, the cat goes woof woof, by which in one fell swoop, the child, by disconnecting the thing from its cry, raises the sign to the function of the signifier, and reality to the sophistics of signification, and in his contempt for verisimilitude, for recognizing a cry which perhaps reminds him of his own, makes necessary the verification of multiple objectifications of the same thing. Does this possibility require the topology of a four corners game? This sort of question seems innocent enough, but it may give us some trouble if the subsequent construction must depend on it. I will spare you the stages by revealing directly the function of the 2 points of intersection in this elementary graph, see graph 2, which is in, we'll get to that in a bit. Or you know what? Hold on. If everybody wants to take a look, it's on the next page. I'll continue reading. The first, labeled A, is the locus of the treasure trove of signifiers, which does not mean of the code, for the one-to-one correspondence between a sign and a thing is not preserved here, the signifier being constituted on the basis of a synchronic and countable collection in which none of the elements is sustained except through its opposition to each of the others. The second, labeled S of A, is what may be called the punctuation, in which signification ends as a finished product. Let us observe the dissymmetry between the one, which is a locus, a place rather than a space, and the other, which is a moment, a scansion rather than a duration.
I think this is really good for this point now of the aporia of the subject and the, this fundamental split nature of the subject between time and place, right? Which is something that Badiou elaborates in beautiful ways in theory of the subject as well. And of course, the anticipation, the logical anticipation of certitude essay on the game theory and the prisoner's dilemma is essential for understanding the subject in relationship to punctuation or to time. We just should note that Lacan's major innovation, apropos clinical innovations, is of course the variable length session, and how all of that is bound up with like a certain theory of the subject's relationship to time. And here he's kind of, you see, I'm sort of going against Danny Nobis, because Danny Nobis in his biography of Lacan has this almost like anti-theoretical claim about that, which is that, yeah, the variable length session was invented almost arbitrarily. I wasn't really happy. You may remember in my second interview with Nobis, he sort of elaborates a poor justification. But I think here, if we take seriously this idea of scansion, which at first blush, scansion seems such a simple procedure or operation, but in fact, actually, if we measure scansion in its effects on the subject, my God, it's extremely profound. And also its consequences for a theory of time are immense. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think like even though the graph 2, 3, or 4 are more complex, I think they often allow more elaboration than the very first graph, because the first graph is just so simple. You don't see the vectors that are implanted in there unless you read the seminars. But I think right here is important because it's not only that you have this sort of inability to close the circuit, which is constantly caught in a vicious circle between the notice it's a little s in parentheses big A and big A, which is the battery bank of all signifiers, which us being versed in seminar 16, we know that it is incomplete. There is no signifier that could close that, right? And so what we have right here is this effect of the I of the statement and the enunciated intersecting with the battery bank of signifiers. But the key thing to realize is that the split subject is caught in two dilemmas. One, addressing the battery bank of all signifiers, which is caught up in this retroactive articulation of enunciation and enunciated, and then also short-circuiting in this imaginary form, which is locked in with the specular image of the I, the ego, which would go down to ego ideal.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And that's the main thing that makes scansioning or punctuating the split of enunciation enunciated so hard, because of the ability to go back in this imaginary investment of the ego, or the sort of, if to dumb it down in more lower Lacanian terms, schema L, right, where there is this imaginary relationship with the other. And I think the point of the scansion is to open up that vector where there's some possibility of closing up A by little s, which is the signified, which is the effect of signification, right? That brings up a closing of the sentence, but the impossibility of closing up of the field of meaning, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very well said. Very well said. I mean, well, I think the logic of scansion still can be applied to the first graph, but it obviously makes a great deal more sense when we look at the second. But let's not jump too far ahead. I think we should continue. Looking at time, I think we have 15 minutes left. So let's try to get to graph 2 and just go like that. We can stop and discuss too, but go on.
Both are related to the offer to the signifier that is constituted by the hole in the real. The one as a hollow for concealment, the other as drilling toward a way out. The subject's submission to the signifier, which occurs in the circuit that goes from S of A to A and back from A to S of A, is truly a circle, inasmuch as the assertion that is established in it, being unable to close on anything but its own scansion, in other words, failing an act in which it would find its certainty, refers back only to its own anticipation in the composition of the signifier, which is in itself meaningless. So there's kind of a...
This is also anxiety, right? That whole loop, and the fact that the signifier is more determinative is the onset of anxiety as well, and this whole notion of anticipation and so on. But
Yeah.
anyways, go on.
No, I think, yeah, it's the part of discourse where you were plagued by the doubt that, maybe what's happening is not completely coherent, but there's also some sort of practical necessity that is encouraging this theory of, I don't know, extempore speech or whatever, that is writing things according to a certain pattern after the fact. I think that's the difference between the first two graphs, which to me raises the question of like special interest with regard to either libidinal overinvestment or material overinvestment, in which both there's like different sorts of, I don't know, motivations for either attaching oneself to the desire for truth or attaching oneself to the desire to remain a mystery. Anyways,
That makes sense. Yeah. No, I think that yeah, the extemporaneous speech. Yeah, yeah, in other words, when the subject has a certain like I guess you could say awareness of um the autonomous operation that the signifier is doing to their body and speech, um I think you're right that there's a certain that provokes a certain anxiety, but also like a perhaps an experimental knowledge that can be derived from there. But go on.
To be possible, the squaring of the circle only requires the completeness of the signifying battery installed in A, henceforth symbolizing the other's locus. This allows us to see that this other is but the pure subject of modern game strategy and is, as such, perfectly accessible to the calculation of conjecture, in the sense that the real subject, in making his own calculations, need not take into account any so-called subjective, in the usual, that is, psychological sense of the term, aberration, but only the inscription of a combinatory whose combinations may be exhaustively enumerated. This squaring of the circle is nevertheless impossible, but solely because the subject constitutes himself only by subtracting himself from it and by decompleting it essentially, such that he must at one and the same time count himself here and function only as a lack here. The other, big other, as preliminary side of the pure subject of the signifier, occupies the key, the maîtresse position here, even before coming into existence here as absolute master, to use Hegel's term, with and against him. For what is omitted in the platitude of modern information theory is the fact that one cannot even speak of a code without it already being the other's code. Something quite different is at stake in the message, since the subject constitutes himself on the basis of the message, such that he receives from the other even the message he himself sends. Thus, the notations A and S of A are justified. Code messages and message codes separate out into pure forms in the psychotic subject. The subject who makes do with this preliminary other alone. Observe, as an aside, that this other, distinguished as the locus of speech, nevertheless emerges as truth's witness. Without the dimension it constitutes, the deceptiveness of speech would be indistinguishable from the feint, which in fighting or sexual display is nevertheless quite different. Deployed in imaginary capture, the feint is integrated into the play of approach and retreat that constituted the first dance, in which these two vital situations find their scansion, and the partners who fall into step with it find what I will dare to write as their dancity, their danciveness. Anyways, moreover, animals show that they are capable of such behavior when they are being hunted down. They manage to throw their pursuers off the scent by briefly going in one direction as a lure and then changing direction. This can go so far as to suggest on the part of game animals the nobility of honoring the pairing found in the hunt. But an animal does not feign feigning. It does not make tracks whose deceptiveness lies in getting them to be taken as false tracks when in fact they are true. That is, tracks that indicate the right trail. No more than it effaces. I mean, how does he know? Anyways, no more than it effaces, and maybe it's just never successfully worked. No more than it effaces its tracks. Oh, you know what I see? Andrew, yes.
Oh, I could wait unless you feel like stopping right now.
I'm going to continue. No more than
Yeah,
it effaces
yeah.
its tracks,
I'll wait.
which would already be tantamount to making itself the subject of the signifier. I think that's a good place. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, this notion of feint is, I mean, I like that he brings it into the animal kingdom, but the way that it articulates in speech is important. And I don't know if he addresses it in any other seminar besides really in seminar 3. And then I like that he brings this up in here, but it has everything to do with deception, which is contrary to another term that he calls in speech as, because it has to do with the message, right? And this is where the subject is trying to articulate the code via the message in the other. He says the two types of things with the message. You have fetus or feeds, which is speech that gives itself. to you, as in the statement, "You are my woman," or the response is, "You are my master," which means that you are what is still within my speech, and I can only affirm by speaking in your place. This speech is speech that commits you, like there are some sorts of vows or, you know, ancillary like things that are put upon in that speech. But there's nothing other than that. It's sort of performative. Whereas feigns is the deceptive one, and the example is the Freudian joke of the Jews on the bridge, where the one says, "You tell me to Krakow, you're going to Krakow, when you want me to think you're going to Littenberg, when really you are going to Krakow. So why are you lying to me?" Right? So there's this sort of play upon deception by stating the obvious via the feint or a sort of lure that is happening at the level of the other, that comes about in this sort of message via the feint, right?
Excellent, Andrew. Thank you for that. Akshay, please.
No, I think that's right. And I just wanted to tack on that, like, I mean, like with lying in general, it is the question of the signifier, in so much as that making an absence present, and then sort of like, because it makes it present, you're able to like manipulate an absence, right? Like, so you can lie, like, as a result. But what was the other, sorry, there was one other thing that was on my mind. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess like, because already like with the very notion of feigning, right? Like there is like, right. I mean, it's making me think about the anticipated time essay you mentioned, right? Like there are three characters who each trying to read this card that's on the other person's head. And they can see the other person's card, they can't see their own card. And they're trying to recognize who they are based on how the others act. And if the others act really certainly, then they know for certain that, you know, but if they know for certain, then, so the others are both trying to come to certainty, but dissimulating the fact that they're coming to certainty, because if they reveal that they were coming to certainty, everyone else would come to certainty. But I mean, like something about that entire play of feigning that suddenly becomes possible with the introduction of language, I thought was present there in some sense.
Yeah, I'm excited to kick off our next session developing this, because in a way, we're introduced to the concept of the ego ideal. We're introduced to the concept of the voice with Graph 2. So like it's all rushing at us, and he's throwing in all of these Lacanian witticisms of like, oh, truth is fiction, and you know what I'm saying? Like he's sort of like moving at a speed which is far too rapid
I
to
would just add,
actually.
because the truth is fiction is also actually a Sartrean line in his book, The Imaginary. And the whole point about it being a fiction is precisely because the signifier makes present and absence. Like that's why
True.
it has the
Yes.
structure of, like in that sense, like I think there's quite a lot of continuity to the, like, anyway, but yeah.
No, that's very interesting. And of course, how I small a in the first movement up, then in the final movement is established with a notation of capital I think is a very significant point regarding the theory of the ego ideal within Lacanian thought, which we probably, I think next time it would be useful, and I'd be happy to make a few remarks about this, make out and draw out the distinction between what is ego ideal and ideal ego. I think we should elaborate more on that next time we meet. And I think that we should also yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like it, but I also feel that perhaps it is moving a little bit fast. And I think the other thing we should do next time is actually bring the graph onto the screen, and we can start going through it step by step. That would be quite.
I have the graph saved on my computer. So I shared the graph too on the
yeah,
chat.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'll pull it up for next time we meet. and we can roll through it. And I think, actually, to be honest with you guys, next Thursday, we should be able to get to graph 3, and then probably our final session together to finish it out would be the complete graph. So that's like a rough timeline, I think, of where we would go. But I think I'd like to start with that next, and just so we're like absolutely clear on each movement. I think we have a vague idea of it now. But yeah, this is excellent.
Should I continue, or are we going to end it here at the top of page 684?
Why don't you just continue just like a little bit more, and then we shall conclude.
All this has been articulated only in a confused way by philosophers who are nevertheless professional. But it is clear that speech begins only with the passage from the feint to the order of the signifier, and that the signifier requires another locus, the locus of the other as witness, the witness who is other than any of the partners, the predator, which will have to sit at the paw prints and decide whether these are a feint, a legitimate feint, and so on. Anyways, yeah. That sort of subject to fill in the invisible mark the subject receives from the signifier, which alienates this subject in the first identification that forms the ego ideal. This is inscribed by the notion I of A, which I must substitute at this stage for S bar, the barred S of the negatively oriented vector, moving S bar from the vector's endpoint to its starting point. And we can once again take a look at graph 2 here.
Okay, keep on going for a little bit.
Yep. This is a retroversion effect by which the subject at each stage becomes what he was to be before that, and he will have been is only announced in the future perfect tense. Here arises the ambiguity of a misrecognizing that is essential to knowing myself, un méconnaître essential me méconnaître. For in this rear view, all the subject can be sure of is the anticipated image which he had caught of which he had caught of himself in his mirror, coming to meet him. I won't go back over the function of my mirror stage here. The first strategic point I developed as an objection to the supposedly autonomous ego in favor in psychoanalytic theory, whose academic restoration justified the mistaken proposal to strengthen the ego in a type of treatment diverted thereafter toward successful adaptation. A phenomenon of mental abdication tied to the aging of the psychoanalytic group in the diaspora owing to the war, and the reduction of an eminent practice to a good housekeeping seal of approval, attesting to its suitability to the American way of life. And here we get, I think he favors, once again, returning to the beginning of the essay, the interruptions of discourse that the hysteric brings to the table, rather than the, the maximalist orientation of the public speaker.
Yeah, let's just read this last paragraph here, because I think this is essential. Be that as it may.
Be that as it may, what the subject finds in this altered image of his body is the paradigm of all the forms of resemblance that will cast a shade of hostility onto the world of objects by projecting onto them the avatar of his narcissistic image, which, from the jubilation derived from encountering it in the mirror, becomes, in confronting his semblables, the outlet for his most intimate aggressiveness.
Okay, keep on going, sorry.
It is this image that becomes fixed. This is the ideal ego, from the point at which the subject fixates as ego ideal. The ego is thus a function of mastery, a game of bearing and constituted rivalry. In the capture it undergoes due to its imaginary nature, the ego masks its duplicity. That is consciousness, in which the ego assures itself in an indisputable existence, a naivete that is displayed in Fenelon's work, is in no way immanent in the ego, but rather transcendent, since consciousness is based on the ego ideal as a unary trait. The Cartesian cogito does not fail to recognize this. As a result, the transcendental ego itself is relativized, implicated as it is in the misrecognition in which the ego's identifications originate.
Okay, I think we can stop there. Yeah, because this movement regarding the subversion of the subject back into uh, ideal ego is something that we need to uh, elaborate a little bit more first time we meet next time.
It is the mirror stage. It is
It
that.
is, it is, but it also, in a certain way, is like the conclusion of graph two in a certain way. If we're understanding the movement from the split subject up through the first cut on through, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there is a certain way that we should read the graph of desire as a graph of desire of a movement that has not a full completion, but something that re-situates the subject in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean that's why I said the term in explaining it in the beginning was the short circuit, because you have two movements of the split subject, one that
Yep.
through A and tries to come back around in that retroactive movement between little SA and A, and the short circuit, because if you notice at the left of the bottom of the big A circle, you have the vector of a new starting point, which is of the vector area of ideal ego, little IA, with the
Yep.
subject going to the M as moi, ego, down to ego ideal. So you have two different circuits happening at the same time, right?
Yeah. Okay,
The
very
little
good.
logins are like beginning points of new circuits.
Right, and we haven't even added the dimension of what the other wants, right?
Mm-hmm.
The posing of the question onto the subject. So, like, in some sense, this sort of story of graphs 1 and 2 are sort of about the subject's relationship to the insertion of a signifier into their field of reality. The other is there only insofar as it's like the other as the battery or locus of signifiers, but we haven't had the introduction of an other that poses a problem or a question to the subject yet. So, yeah. Of course, I love the reference to the Good Housekeeping. That's funny. Okay, cool. All right, are we good? Are you guys enjoying this? Yeah, hell yeah. It's hard, but it's very much worth it.
Oh, this is a really good essay. I think a lot of the Acree essays are really hard, but this one's like really fun to go back to and read.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Really
it's so essential. It's so, so good. Excellent, guys. So we'll meet next Thursday, and then I want to say the Thursday after that, we'll have a guest speaker, but she's going to be in the morning, Stephanie. So we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. To be continued. Okay.
It was
All
a
the best.
pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everyone.